Coming up this weekend is UFC Nashville. This is going to be aired on Fox Sports 1. It's going to be the third event in 3 weeks for the UFC. Not really any fight on this card in particular that stands out as like a must-see fight if you're looking for like your typical main event where you kind of have like your two top five guys going at it. This fight's got a lot of interesting matchups, but none of these fights I'd really feel are just really main event worthy. To me, the fight that interests me most is going to be John Dodson versus Eddie Wineland. This is going to be two top 10 guys at bantamweight. But if we're going down the card from top to bottom and just kind of having a quick run through it, the main event will be between Cub Swanson and Artem Lobov. I think here the most impressive thing is the fact that Artem Lobov was able to land this fight. He has no business fighting a guy like Cub Swanson right now. He has no business fighting a guy who's in the top 10 right now. And what Cub Swanson has said is true, that if Artem Lobov was not Conor's training partner and if Conor didn't think so highly of him, he probably isn't even in the UFC. Lobov does not have a very impressive record at all, but he is here. He is talking well, and he is talking himself into some big fights, and if he can get a win here, that would be enormous for his career. If you're looking at this fight technically and breaking it down, there really isn't one area that you'd give Lobov the advantage. On the ground, Cub Swanson's much better. I believe Cub Swanson's still a better wrestler. If Cub wanted to take this fight to the ground and beat up Lobov, I'd imagine that he could. And on the feet, Cub, though he's been susceptible to some hard shots on the feet before, he's still the better boxer in my eyes than Artem Lobov. And with that being said, though, Lobov is still a very good striker, and his striking is his best aspect. And if Cub gets lured into a striking matchup with Lobov, though I don't think Lobov wins, Lobov has a much better chance than if this becomes a grappling match. And I have a feeling that Cub's going to want to keep this fight on the feet. And if he does that, though you should be surprised if Lobov wins, you shouldn't be stunned if Lobov wins. But again, if we're picking this fight, if we're betting on this fight, you have to pick Cub Swanson. In the co-main event, you have L.I. Quinta returning after a long layoff between, I believe there were some injury things, but also there were some issues with pay. He ended up just saying, okay, fine, well, this real estate thing isn't working out for me. I guess I got to come back. So for him, you always have to wonder what the long layoff's going to do. Diego Sanchez, not exactly the guy you want to fight after a long layoff, because generally if you're going to have an issue with adrenaline or you're having an adrenaline dump, fighting a guy who just keeps coming after you like Sanchez is not the ideal matchup. You'd imagine that if Quinta fights like he did in his last fight before the layoff, he should get the victory here, but I feel like that's going to be the biggest question there, and for that reason, I'm not going to put any money down on this. I'm not entirely sure who's going to win, but if the odds for Sanchez look favorable enough to you, this might be a chance to pick the upset. The next fight is Ovis St. Preux versus Marcus Rogerio de Lima. St. Preux, up until the John Jones fight, was a guy who was kind of hanging around the top. He was sort of in the Jimmy Manuwa territory, where he was just one really big win away from getting into the title picture, but wasn't able to get it. Lost to John Jones and has had some losses since. This should be a winnable fight for him, though it won't be an easy fight. Then the next fight on the card is the one that I talked about as being my main event, John Dodson versus Eddie Wineland. This fight interests me in a lot of ways. Wineland's a guy where he's able to string together a couple wins here. He has like these small little win streaks that he has, and he does it against really impressive guys, and he does it impressively. In this case, right now, he's on a 2-fight win streak where he beat Frankie Saenz by knockout, and then he beat who was that guy who Dominic Cruz and Cody Garbrandt both beat? Mizugaki. He also knocked out Takeya Mizugaki. So he's going to be coming into this fight on a 2-fight knockout win streak going against John Dodson. There's going to be a pretty distinct speed disadvantage here. But with that being said, Eddie Wineland has a couple of training partners who are surprisingly effective at being able to mimic what John Dodson does. And to think that Wineland's going to come into this fight and not be able to handle the speed, I can tell you right now, I know otherwise. He can definitely handle Dodson's speed. That being said, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be an easy fight for him. Wineland has trouble against guys who kick well. Dodson can kick, although that's not necessarily his best game. But this is a fight that I think is going to be a lot more competitive than you might think between a guy like John Dodson, who holds a win over TJ Dillashaw, and a guy like Eddie Wineland, who has worked his way to a title shot, had a fight with Burrell, but isn't a guy who's normally thought of as like a top 5 perennial guy. The fight after that is Joe Lozon versus Stevie Ray. This just seems like it's an exciting fight waiting to happen. And then the main card is topped out by Jake Ellenberger and Mike Perry. Interesting that Perry would get a fight with Ellenberger after coming off a loss against Joban. You'd figure he'd probably get pushed against someone who's a little bit easier, but these two have been drawing at it back and forth. They've had a little interview they did on Chael Sonnen's podcast with, I think it was the Behind the Fight one, where they were just going back and forth. It seems like an entertaining matchup. There seems to be some animosity there, but that's kind of Mike Perry in a nutshell. He has animosity with anyone he's fighting. And then on the prelims, the FS2 prelims, there's Talis Leitis versus Sam Alvey. Kind of surprising to see Leitis buried on FS2, but this could be a really interesting fight if he's able to get Alvey down. You'd imagine this is going to be a pretty typical Talis Leitis fight, but Alvey's always dangerous on the feet, so you never know. Dustin Ortiz versus Brandon Moreno. Moreno right now holds a top 10 ranking after having that win over Louis Smolka and looking pretty good ever since then. With Smolka falling off, you have to wonder, are we jumping the gun on Moreno being a top 10 guy? But Ortiz will be a real test for him. Holtzman versus McBride you've got, and you've also got Jessica Penne versus Danielle Taylor. That fight, it could be interesting. Taylor is very short, likes to throw heavy punches, but isn't exactly the most technical. Penne is the much more technical fighter. You'd probably imagine she gets the win there. You got Alexis Davis versus Cindy Dandois on the UFC Fight Pass prelims. Brian Barberino versus Joe Proctor. And Hector Sandoval versus Matt Danger Chanel.